Marvellous. So look, without any further ado, we're going to kick off with our first session. So as I say, we've got Fazilet and Karen joining us. Fazilet is going to kick off first of all, and we'll be speaking for around 15 minutes, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. So welcome. Are you there, Fazilet? Is the system working?
I'm so pleased to be with you all. I'm going to talk this morning about how we use the social model of disability to reframe our thinking around disability and to remove barriers to disabled people's employment. We're at such a pivotal moment, aren't we? Because we're 25 years since the Disability Discrimination Act, which was the first civil rights legislation in the UK. We've just had 8 months of a pandemic where a spotlight has been shone on some of the inequalities experienced by disabled people. And round the corner next year, the government's publishing its disability strategy. There's 7.7 million disabled people of working age, 19% of the working age population. And as Kate pointed out earlier, only just over 50% of us are in employment, as opposed to over 80% of the wider population. That's a huge gap, as is the gap in employment, where we find disabled people in some of the lower grade, lower paid roles. So there is also a disability pay gap. The pandemic has actually worsened this situation, and we're beginning to see the evidence of that with research reports. Particularly, I'm thinking of Citizens Advice report, Leonard Cheshire report, which are beginning to show the disproportionate adverse impact on disabled people falling out of the labour market through redundancies, more likely to have shorter hours. And of course, with higher unemployment, disabled people will struggle more to get into employment. So this is a very good time for this conference, and really looking at how we redouble our efforts to create disability inclusion. Disability inclusion is a collective endeavour. It's not just the job of the HR professionals or the line manager, and it's certainly not just the job of disabled employees. It's the job of all of us. I think the brilliant thing about the social model of disability is that it gives us a way of framing the organisation and really looking at all parts of it to really get to what might be putting up barriers to disabled people or stopping us flourish within the workforce. Before I talk a bit more about the social model, I want to touch on disability equality, because particularly through the pandemic, I think there is a need to actually reassert the fact that disabled people are equal citizens. Through the pandemic, some of us feel like we've been ignored, overlooked, and sometimes patronised. Yet we belong to society. We're 20% of the population. We're part of families, communities. We contribute to the workforce. We're consumers. We sometimes need help, but we also give help. So we are part of society. We shouldn't be made to feel that we're additional or something different or other. We've had a couple of incidents during the pandemic, which has really made some disabled people very, very shocked about assumptions that are made about our lives and the worth of our lives. So in March, we saw the National Institute of Health and Care Excellence bring out guidance which actually deprioritise people from receiving critical care if they received support at home. And whilst NICE withdrew the guidance and said it didn't apply to people with long-term disabilities, in a sense that message, that worry remained that we weren't equal. That was followed a couple of weeks later by some doctors sending out letters to people in care homes and people with learning disabilities in residential settings, asking for do not attempt resuscitation notices to be signed. And again, although this action was condemned because there should never be blanket notices, It should always be a personal, individual discussion. That left a bad taste, and again left a lot of disabled people feeling that our lives aren't valued equally. I think the term vulnerable that was bandied about a lot in the pandemic also didn't help that feeling that somehow we weren't as important. The term vulnerable seemed to turn the clock back. So rather than talking about disability, we talked about the vulnerable. And that term takes away choice and control and agency. And it kind of confers a victim status. So I think there were some things about the pandemic that really made us feel that we need to reassert disability equality. We are equal citizens. And I think to make progress on the inclusion agenda, we not only need to believe that disabled people are equal, we need to act in a way that shows we believe that. Coming to the social model, which is a really amazing concept. It's very simple. It's really about how you look at the things that disable us being systemic and societal or institutional. So you start with, if you like, the big picture. You don't focus in to the disabled person. To give you an example, so I'm blind. So if someone gives me a hard copy print document, I'm obviously going to struggle. But if someone gives me that document in a digital format that's accessible or gives it to me in audio, I'm absolutely fine. So the way you treat me can either disable me or it can enable me. It's not my impairment that's stopping me reading a document. It's the way that society and the systems are giving me that document. So that's a very simple example. Disabled people, and me among them, have found the social model very liberating because there is, perhaps when I started losing my sight, I kind of felt it was all down to me. It's my problem, it's my issue, it's my impairment. But actually the social model enables you to see that actually if society was redesigned differently, a lot of the things that I find difficult would fall away. So what is covered by the social model? What kind of barriers does the social model see disabling us? Well, attitudinal barriers, which I've already discussed this morning, people having low expectations of us, people having negative assumptions about our lives. Institutional barriers, so policies, practices, services being inaccessible. Environmental barriers, so it being hard for us to move around the streets, buildings, to use transport. And information barriers, information, maybe personal letters, bank statements, utility bills, general information. So those are some of the barriers that we can experience, and they are all so solvable, aren't they? The social model is sometimes contrasted to the medical model, which is much more about our impairments, perhaps trying to fix us, to put us right, perhaps seeing our deficits as opposed to our assets. So the social model actually is in opposition to the medical model. I mean, both models are useful, but obviously you can see from my description of the medical model that in terms of making the workplace inclusive, the social model has much more to offer us in terms of understanding how society works and trying to fix society, not the individual. So let me just talk about how the social model could apply if you're looking at an organisation through that social model lens. How would it help us to take a whole organisation approach? Well, I just want to run through 6 areas that I think would help us to do that. And I'm sure speakers later in the day will focus in much more on these areas and talk about them in much more detail. The first, I think, for me is business goals. I actually believe that all business goals probably do have a disability inclusion element, whether you're designing products that can be more inclusively designed, whether you're designing a service that has disabled customers, whether you're thinking about how you deliver things to the population at large or beneficiaries if you're a charity. If you really integrate the needs of disabled customers and consumers and users into your business goals, I think that will help you more easily to drive disability inclusion internally. And the second area I want to touch on is what I've called living the message. So it's really about the CEO and the top team really championing disability inclusion. I think that is enormously important. I really think that team should know how many disabled people are employed by an organisation, where they are in the workforce, and have plans to increase recruitment of disabled people and to make sure they flourish at work through getting the right support and development. That top team taking that interest can release and empower everyone in the organisation to begin to remove barriers to inclusion. The third area is creating an inclusive culture. Not always that easy, I recognise, but so important. It's so important that disabled people in the workforce feel like we belong. We're not just an addition, we're part of things, that we feel confident and at ease sharing our personal stories and talking about our needs. And particularly I'm thinking of the psychological safety that will allow people with hidden impairments to share them, you know, so they feel that they are in an environment where they can be open about them. The fourth area is very important. It's the policies relating to people. It's those policies that make sure that people are recruited for their potential as well as their experience, that the recruitment processes are looking for diversity. It's integral to make sure there's a diverse workforce, that appraisal and review processes really support disabled staff to talk about their support needs and meeting their objectives. The policies that around reasonable adjustments, flexible working, home working, disability leave, that are all designed to help disabled people flourish, and the stamping out of harassment and discrimination and helping disabled people to tackle those issues when they occur. The fifth area is around infrastructure. How do we make sure our buildings are completely accessible, all corners of them, not just a few little short, small areas? And how do we make sure, very importantly, that our digital systems are accessible, both our customer-facing systems and our internal communication systems? And finally, just touching on how we make sure that, I've got my sixth issue now, but yeah, how we make sure our communication and engagement processes work for everyone, how we set up two-way communication, but using different modes, so face-to-face briefings, intranets, town hall meetings, lots of different ways so that people have the space to speak and contribute. In conclusion, as I said, I think it's really, really important that we do address disability equality. Do we think disabled people's lives are equal, and do we act on that belief? If disabled people belong to our society, how do we show that in our businesses and our organisations? How do we use the social model as a way of looking at the whole organisation and really getting to the root causes of the barriers and addressing them? Just on the pandemic, as Kate says, there have been some good things about the pandemic. I think the focus on how really outcomes rather than how we get the job done. You know, does it really matter if we work from home sometimes or have more flexible ways of working? If we can deliver the outcomes, I'd really hope we can keep that going into the future, real focus on outcome, not process. And finally, I hope the pandemic and the spotlight it's shone on disability equality reignites all of us to have greater ambition to create a world where disabled people are equal and full participants. Thank you so much.
Fazilet, that's wonderful. I could listen to you forever. One question from me, Faz. I mean, as you have a really rich experience in the different organisations that you have worked for. And for many of us who have been, I suppose, close to the process of, you know, either developing or campaigning for or enhancing the legislations, you know, the original DDA and of course now the Equality Act, you know, where do you see the greatest strides as you look back? Where do you see the greatest efforts from employers? You know, is it around, I suppose, realising, you know, I suppose, you know, making manifest the workplace adjustment policy and practice as a result of the legislation? Is it about raising the awareness of the social model, such a fundamental? Where do you see the greatest strides?
It's very hard to say. I mean, I genuinely think the Disability Discrimination Act has changed my life, and I know there's lots wrong with society, but I'd really thank the campaigners and the parliamentarians that made that possible. The kind of things I'd point to, definitely reasonable adjustments, because in a way that took the social model, didn't it, and said we need to change the way we do things and we need to put things in place. And reasonable adjustments aren't all about giving me an accessible computer and a support worker. They are much broader. They are about how the organisation changes what it delivers. In terms of kind of what companies deliver as well, I think, you know, I've particularly, it sounds very strange to say this, but I think the private sector have made much greater strides than the public sector in actually delivering the Disability Discrimination Act. So, you know, within months, I had a Braille bank statement, you know, utility bills in the right format, you know, I don't know how long it took to get assistance on the railways, but I can see the signs of the Equality Act and reasonable adjustments being made all around me. I feel it's been a bit more of a struggle with the public sector, and I think the last 8 months have kind of highlighted that, ironically, it's the public sector that have got quite a lot of work to do. And I don't mean to let the private sector off the hook at all, but I do applaud what they've done for disabled consumers and citizens. And I think some of them are making amazing strides on disabled employees as well.
Great stuff, Fazilet. A couple of questions. You're clearly triggering lots of thoughts from our wonderful delegates. So a couple of questions. One is around just asking you to expand on your thoughts around COVID. You know, what is it about the supercharged digital era and remote working, which, you know, what are the features that you perhaps would like us to retain as a society? You know, as we know, lots of disabled people have been wanting to work from home for a very long time. And yeah, is the point now proven? What are your thoughts?
I think it is proven. I mean, definitely proven. I mean, digital is so double-edged for disabled people, because for some disabled people, the pandemic has been horrendous. You know, they've been in hospitality and retail and leisure, the industries that have been very hard hit. They can't do their jobs from home. But for people who can do jobs from home, and, you know, it isn't all disabled people, but for those of us that can, I've seen nothing but a kind of frustration that it didn't come earlier. Like lots of, well, it's okay now that people without disabilities are benefiting. You know, this could have been done a long time ago. But also a genuine feeling that actually let's retain this, because if I've got a energy limiting illness, where I fluctuate from day to day and what I can do, it gives me the flexibility to be on and off work in ways that suit me. If transport's very difficult because I struggle with it, or at the moment because I need to shield, again, it's very useful. I think it's about, if you can really show that the business objectives and the outcomes of your work really aren't impacted, why would you stop anyone from working flexibly? And I think that applies. I think because now that's become almost mainstream. We often see when something becomes mainstream, and it's not just for a particular group, and everyone's got now in their heads that this could benefit so many people. It could benefit people with caring responsibilities, disabled people, all sorts of people. So I hope it remains a feature of the workplace.
Yeah, great stuff. Fazilet, as you know, I have the very great pleasure of heading up Purple Space, and we talk to hundreds of thousands of disabled employees within employee resource groups and networks. And one of the very common themes that's come from the dialogue with them is how they want to retain certain features of remote working, and lots of examples of where life is made just a little bit easier, often because managing impairment, behind the scenes, which is often not surfaced, as we interact with our employers, it can sometimes be made the easier. So you prompt lots of thoughts. Now, another great question here is, many organisations have managers that are ignorant about people's needs, especially around individuals who are on the neurodiverse spectrum. How do we address this? How do we help line managers to understand maybe the needs of people from neurodiverse communities?
Yeah, I agree. I'm sure there is a lot of ignorance about that impairment and many others. It's a difficult one. I know, obviously, I suppose a stock answer would be training, awareness, etc. I kind of feel that the organisation has to create a culture where people with different abilities and different ways of doing things and different impairments can talk quite openly about what they need. I mean, I know I can only relate it to my experience. I'm unique. I know I'm blind, but I probably need different things than other blind people. And I don't want anyone to say to me, I've employed a blind person, I know all about you, I've been on a training course, I know what you need. I want to be able to have that conversation with my manager about my particular needs, both related to the job and my particular degree of sight loss. And I don't think there's any thing we can do that will compensate for being confident to have that conversation one-to-one, where a manager can just ask people, what do you need? What do you really need to be able to deliver your job in the best possible way? What can I do? What can you do? What can team members do? So that you're truly a flourishing member of the team, and we're making sure that we're taking your needs into account. I don't think there's anything that's better than that ability to have that individual conversation.
Yeah, it's great input there, Fazilet. You're so right. On the one hand, your colleagues jumping into the chat saying agree, training is key, but as you so ably pull out, everybody's different. All of us are individuals, and just because we might share the same impairments doesn't mean for 1 minute that the same solutions or workplace adjustments are the same. Great stuff. Look, time marches on. So Fazilet, for the moment, thank you so much. I mean,
thank you, Kate.
Really neat entry to the day, and lovely to see you again. And hopefully you'll be with us for a bit longer. Good. So without any further ado, I'm really delighted to now introduce you to Karen Jackson, who's the founder director of Did Law. Karen, are you there? I can see you lurking in the system. I'm wondering if you can turn your camera on and unmute yourself.
You should be able to see me. Hold on. There you go.
Fantastic. Don't you just love it when the system works?
I'm not very gifted with technology, I'm afraid. Good morning, Kate.
Yeah, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Absolute pleasure.
Joining. So over to you.
Great. Good morning, everybody. I'm Karen Jackson. I'm the managing director and of Did Law. I'm a solicitor. We are a London-based law firm specialising in disability discrimination. I've been doing this job for just over 12 years, and I'm not going to talk about myself a great deal, but I just want to give you a little bit of background into where I come from on disability. And it is this is absolutely a passion of mine, because I do not think we can call ourselves a civilized nation when we still have circumstances where people with disabilities are treated as second-class citizens. We've seen the progress that has been made across other areas and other protected characteristics, such as sexual orientation, race and ethnicity. We need to see the same kind of progress in disability, because to my mind, it's always been the poor cousin of the protected characteristics that the law protects, and that needs to change. I agree that a lot has been done for the good, and I don't want to come across as at all negative. You'll appreciate I'm a litigator, so I see when it all goes wrong, but I also do know that there are good employers out there who are doing good things and making it better. It's interesting to note that it's 25 years since the Disability Discrimination Act came into force. That's quite young for a piece of legislation. It sounds a long time, but you know, things like sex and race have been legislated for almost twice as long. So we're still at the beginning of a journey. It's 10 years since the Equality Act, and that had some really important changes around disability, which we're still seeing come through. So again, you know, progress being made, but much more to be done. In particular, Section 15 of the Act, which I will talk about. Now, I've got 15 minutes to talk about the rights, responsibilities and definitions in the Equality Act. I could talk for 15 hours about this, so it's a bit of a wild run through, a whistle-stop tour. And I'm sure that most of the people here this morning are here because they have a deep interest in the subject and they already understand the law very well. What I wanted to add really was background from my experience and practical examples, because that's where I can add value, because I've spent so long in this space. And you know, I can share some observations of where things have gone wrong, quite simple things, minor changes that can be made to the way disability is managed at work, which will make a huge difference to the cultural feel of the organisation, which is, you know, where most of the work needs to be done. It needs to be, you know, creating a culture, as the last speaker said, where people are happy and free to talk about their disability without any sense of judgment or you know, feeling awkward. I think it's ironic that people are quite open about, for example, their sexual orientation at work, but they don't want to disclose the fact that they might have an invisible disability. There's something not right there, and that's a cultural issue for many organisations to deal with. I think attitudes are changing, and just the one thing I would like to say about COVID, it's been a difficult year for everybody. I've been locked in at home for almost 9 months because of my health issues. I had a heart transplant 14 years ago, and I'm on the list of clinically vulnerable people. The one thing we've seen from COVID is people have been a bit kinder You know, we've been out on our doorsteps clapping for the NHS. It's been an opportunity to think about how life is for other people who maybe aren't as fortunate as we are. And I do think that for workers with disabilities, the impact of the pandemic and being able to work from home should be really positive, because there have been an awful lot of employers who have said, no, you can't work from home. We can't run our business from home. We can't have teams spirit if we're at home. So no, you can't work from home. Well, the pandemic has shown that we can work from home. And I think it's going to be very difficult for a lot of employers to backtrack on that and to say, no, you can't have as a reasonable adjustment continuation of your home working arrangements. So, you know, I think that may be just one of the real positives coming out of COVID. I'm going to share my screen with you now so that I can talk to my slides. Bear with me to make sure I get the right screen. 1 second. Okay. It's coming, I promise. Right. Kate, can you just let me know that you can see that?
Yes, that's perfect.
Yeah, okay, perfect. Right, so yeah, I've just put a little quote about myself there from Chambers and Partners. I'm not boasting, but they do call me a foremost expert on this area of law. I think you'll struggle to find somebody who's spent more time in this space than I have, and having read all the judgments. So I've got a lot of views. I don't apologise for that. You're all aware that the first legislation we saw on disability was a DDA in 1995. Really quite late for this to be legislated for. And, you know, whether you're pro or against Brexit, thank you to the EU for bringing that into English law and enshrining it in the DDA. The Act was consolidated into the Equality Act in 2010, along with all the other protected characteristics, age, sex, etc. And it broadly was the same as under the DDA, but with one quite significant change, which was section 15 of the Equality Act. And I'll talk about that in a minute, but that's the one, discrimination arising in consequence of disability. It made the disability provisions broader, and it made it in some ways easier for employees to mount a claim of disability discrimination if they needed to. The law is found in a number of other documents, which I've spelt out there. The one in pink, the Equality and Human Rights Commission Employment Statutory Code of Practice. I'm surprised at how few practitioners and HR people don't use this code. You can buy it. It looks a bit like an old Yellow Pages. It's quite a chunky book, but you can download it free online. And I cannot stress how excellent it is for explaining how the law works, not just around disability, but around all the protected characteristics. And I often refer clients to it, and I say, look, you've got a right to reasonable adjustments. Have a look at the EHRC code, because it gives you examples of things that you can ask your employer to do. So if this isn't on your favourites on your desktop and you are managing disability at work, get yourself an early Christmas present. It's free to download online, and it's fantastic. I can't say more about that. I think everybody is aware of the definition in law of what a disability is. Again, slightly peculiar as distinct from all the other protected characteristics, that with disability, you have to prove that you have a disability. In the other characteristics, such as sex, you don't have to prove you're a woman, or you don't have to prove you're pregnant. But with disability, because it has the power to be a very broad-ranging provision, it was felt necessary to put some sort of parameters around what exactly is a disability. And that's to say that if you have a long-term impairment, you won't necessarily qualify as a disabled person under the Act. The Act asks for a more substantial test, and you will all be familiar with the elements of that, which are you need to have a physical or mental impairment, or you could have both. The impairment has to have a substantial impact. That's not as difficult as it sounds, because it will be substantial as long as it's more than minor or trivial. So that's quite a low hurdle. Long term means it has to have lasted 12 months or be likely to last 12 months or be lifelong. And finally, it has to have an adverse effect on the person's ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities. Now, since the DDA, the bulk of the case law in disability discrimination law has centred around this definition of disability. Is somebody disabled or not? And it is often the first point of attack for employers when they're defending a claim. Is to say, but actually we don't accept that you are a disabled person. And I think if you're an employer, you need to take care here, because an employment tribunal will not look kindly on you if you put somebody who is quite clearly a disabled employee to the trouble of having to prove that they are a disabled person. You know, there are circumstances where you quite, you know, obviously have to acknowledge that this is not fighting ground. I think that there's no longer a requirement that the impairment is clinically well recognised. That was a requirement of the DDA. So in many ways, it is easier to prove a disability under this Act, but that's just the definition there. I'm just going to talk a little bit more about definition because it's important. I mean, obviously, a lot of the participants at today's event won't have to go through these hoops because there are obvious impairments, but there are 3/4 automatic disabilities where that test I've just explained doesn't apply. And they are if you have cancer, if you have multiple sclerosis, or if you have HIV. And people say, well, why those 3 particular automatic disabilities? Surely it should include other things like Parkinson's or, you know, whatever. The reason is because at the time the Act was going through Parliament, particular lobby groups were you know, making a lot of noise about certain kinds of conditions being automatically protected, and you know, he who shouts loudest wins, and that was really the story of how we've come to have those automatic disabilities. The other one is people with severe sight impairments, as long as they cannot be corrected with auxiliary aids. So, for example, if someone has a very, very severe eye problem, but they can wear contact lenses or glasses to correct it, that will not amount to disability. There's quite a lot of conditions which are excluded from the Act. There's quite a long list. It's things like kleptomania, exhibitionism, personality disorder, tattooing, hay fever. And if you have one of those conditions, you will not qualify as disabled under the Act. But where employers sometimes fall foul is that often an employee will have more than one condition, and one of those conditions might be excluded and one might not. So, for example, the case I've given here, Power and Panasonic, alcoholism is excluded as a disability, but I have dealt with many cases where my client is an alcoholic, but also has serious depression, which is lifelong. And as long as the person has one condition that qualifies under the Act, it doesn't matter if there's an excluded condition alongside. Can't tell you how many times I've received a letter saying, well, yes, your client might be might be depressed, but she's an alcoholic and therefore the Act does not apply. It absolutely does. And quite often, particularly with something like alcoholism or drug addiction, which is also an excluded condition, there will be another underlying condition as well. I think where the definition of disability is the trickiest is when it comes to the so-called invisible disabilities, and in particular a number of mental health conditions where it's not quite as clear cut as you might like. The case law has provided over the years lots of really good examples of the kinds of disabilities that have been established under the Act. It won't surprise you to know that it's things like dyslexia, diabetes, epilepsy, breast cancer, generalized anxiety disorder, lots of the neurodiverse conditions. The one that's caused a lot of debate is the question of, is obesity a disability? And obesity is something that has come up again in the media around the pandemic, and suggestions that certain kinds of people are more prone to getting severe complications from the coronavirus. Obesity in itself is unlikely to be a disability, but what it is more likely is that that provokes underlying conditions such as problems with blood pressure that need medication, diabetes, that sort of thing. So it's looking at the condition in the round and saying, is this something which is causing, substantial adverse effect? There have been some borderline cases where diabetes that can be corrected by diet was held not to be a disability because there was a way to cure it, and it didn't involve medication. And I should at this point just point out the rule, which is when you're assessing if somebody is disabled or not under the Act, you discount the effect of any treatment. So if the person is taking medication, you discount that and say, how would they be able to function on a day-to-day level if they did not have that medication? So you'll come across this in practice where an employer might say, well, that person says they have depression, but they're absolutely fine in the office. But if you removed the mechanisms that enable that person to cope, such as therapy and medication, it would probably be quite a different picture. So you have to take into consideration. There is, sorry, I'm whizzing through because I'm running out of time and I've got so much to say. Other factors to consider are variable, fluctuating, recurring conditions, progressive conditions, cumulative conditions, because there are slightly different rules around all of these, but you've got to open your mind to considering them. So I've already said that hay fever is not a disability, it's an excluded condition. But if somebody has hay fever and they have asthma, it might be that the combined effect of those two things is enough to amount to a disability. Progressive conditions, generally somebody might start out not showing any signs of adverse impact on their daily ability to do their work, but some symptoms will start to show. I acted for a chap who had early onset Parkinson's, and there was no sign at all that he was impaired, but he started to have some problems at work to do with memory and concentration, and at that point the disability provisions kicked in because it was starting to have an impact on him. When you assess disability is probably one of the trickiest parts of the law, because you have to think about whether the disability was a disability at the time when the discrimination took place. And a classic example of this is where you'll have somebody who's off sick, let's say with depression, they didn't have depression before, so it's not already long term, but they are likely to be ill for more than a year, and therefore they might be disabled. This is a subject of loads of problems when it comes to litigation.
Karen, just to give you a 2-minute call.
2-minute call. Oh
yeah,
my goodness, I've got too much to say.
Brilliant stuff. Brilliant stuff.
The different rights, I will literally spend half a minute on these because you all know them. But Section 13 is direct discrimination. That is, I will not hire you because you are blind. It is very, very unusual and hard to find evidence of. So it's not something that is really terribly common. The two big ones are the Section 15 discrimination and reasonable adjustments. Most of the case law over the last 25 years has been around failure to make reasonable adjustments. And it frustrates the life out of me that should be the case, because the whole point of reasonable adjustments is to remove barriers which hinder the full and effective participation of disabled people in working life. And some of them are so straightforward. We heard earlier about, home working and flexible working patterns. It also frustrates me that a lot of employers do not use the Services of Access to Work, which is a government organisation which will provide funding and which will help you assess what kind of adjustments you might want to be providing for your employees. The one thing I'm just going to say about harassment is this, I see far too much of this, and it's where somebody who is asking for reasonable adjustments is basically ignored, sidelined, kept waiting for weeks and weeks. This doesn't make people happy. What it does is it makes people feel violated, excluded, worthless. It throws them into the arms of lawyers. So if the one thing you do is to make your people feel valued, it's please do not ignore somebody who is asking you for an adjustment. Sit down and talk to them, ask them what it is that they want, try it out, give it a trial period. That's another thing that really frustrates me, because a lot of simple adjustments can be made which will change the life of somebody with a disability. And I don't understand why employers will just say no. Just finally, because I probably have got 20 seconds, who is liable? Remember, especially if you're an HR person listening to this talk, or you are a line manager, it's not just the company that is liable for discrimination. It is you. You are personally liable. Somebody can bring a claim against you and your estate. They can come after your house if they want to. You can also be liable for discrimination because you have aided it, or you have caused it, or induced it. So if you're an HR person and then a manager says, I don't want to hire that person because she's got a disability, you are also complicit in that act of discrimination if you then do not hire that applicant. Last word, because I'm going 100 miles an hour.
Yeah, we need to close now.
The Act applies before, during and after employment. So you've got to think about what you do when you're recruiting, and you've also got to think about what you do after somebody's left, and in particular, what you say when you give a reference. That's me. I will unshare my screen and deal with any questions that I may.
Karen, that's absolutely cracking. I am a real train spotter when it comes to legislation. I've been around the block for a really long time, so it's just lovely to see your energy and your own appetite for the law. I mean, one question that's come through, or a comment, which is from Chris, saying, really think it's important to acknowledge that some of these discrimination cases occur through no malicious, lost the question. I mean, what would your thought be there, Karen?
No, I absolutely agree. And had I had longer, that would have been one of the things I would have said, because I actually think it's quite unusual for there to be a deliberate campaign against somebody who has a disability in the workplace. I'll caveat that slightly, because I still think attitudes to mental health are really bad. It's getting better, but it is not anywhere near it needs to be. We do not very often act for people who have sight impairments or mobility impairments, because employers will say, of course, if you need some special equipment, or if you need a ground floor office, we can do that. But they're not quite as willing to do things for people who might have long-term health conditions. But we do still see things. I acted against a university where their fire plan was to tell my client, who was in a wheelchair, that if there was a fire, she needed to evacuate by sliding down the stairs on her bottom. You know, I mean, that is the kind of archaic attitude that you still do see. So no, I would agree. I don't think it's always malice. What I do think is that there's a lot of fear around disability, and I think if I could change one thing, it would be this, and it would be talk to the people in your organization who have disabilities. You know, they're not any different from you. We're all the same. We're all people. Because you're a disabled person doesn't mean you're a separate category of person. But there's a lot of fear. And, you know, I see that. I remember when I was a kid, we had a brownies. A young girl came to visit us who had Downs. And all the girls just couldn't get further enough away from this child. I went over to her. She actually bit me, but I went over to this child and I was like, hello. And I realized that she was just the same as me, just a little girl who just looked different. But there's too much fear. And I think
what would your one message be? Karen, so true. What would your one message be? Because you're touching on the human frailties that we have. Nobody wants to look and feel and to cause offence. The majority of individuals. So what would your key message be to help line managers and others, just to make it easy for them to feel okay about asking daft questions, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really big one because you know, I'm a bit of a hypocrite, because when I had my heart problem, I never told anybody that I had a heart problem because I didn't want pity. And I think that's something that people with disabilities find really difficult to swallow. It's like, don't pity me. My life's great. I actually have a better life than you because I make the most of it, or whatever. There's still too many assumptions made about what it is to be a disabled person. And I think we need people with disabilities to be more mainstream and to be more vocal. I mean, you see it a bit more now on telly, where you've got actors and actresses who are chosen for their part, not because they're a disabled person on TV, but because they're playing a part. And it's normalizing things. And I just don't understand that fear. So I mean, I suppose if I was saying to an HR person or a line manager, you know, just treat your disabled staff as you would treat everybody else, with respect, with dignity. You know, chat to them about normal stuff. You know, don't define them by the fact that they have a difference.
Yeah, brilliant. Karen, that's absolutely wonderful. Great last message to leave everybody with. Really, as I say, lovely to see your engagement with the law and your energy and your positivity and your passion for this. Lots of thanks are coming through on the chat. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Karen. So lots of reflections. You triggered lots of thoughts and feelings in a good way. Huge thank you.